Hey YouTube viewers, hashtag my global family. This is Abeita, the YouTube academic, here with your hashtag Abeita reality dose. Today is Thursday, May 7th, 2020, and I officially have taught my last course of the semester, you guys. Woohoo! I survived. I'm wearing my bling today to talk to you about income inequality. It was something that had come up as a thread throughout my classes because we reflect a lot on intersectionality and our own positionality, our social location. We talk about race, class, gender, sexuality, religion, belief systems, your linguistic background, your cultural background, and how all of these different intersecting parts of yourself make up your lived experience, right? And we use those different lenses to help interpret how society works out the way that it does. Right? So we use our critical thinking skills and we use the application of real theory and critical theory to our lived experiences to make sense of the world. And what I kept hearing from my students was this perpetuation of the American culture of shame, right? And it's the shaming of you guys did not make it. You did not bootstrap yourself up in a middle class, upper middle class status. You don't have your car and you're second this, that, or the other. And you blah, 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 right? I heard my students talking in a deficit perspective about themselves. And I would be like, stop. No, you are amazing the way you are. You know, and to hold ourselves to these unrealistic expectations is to do a service to our very survival, right? I am wearing this bling today, ironically and not ironically, because I talk about the privilege that I was born into. Because of the assimilation forced upon my family, because of a ramification of Indian boarding schools, my family went through the very traumatic and violent process of becoming American. Right? It meant that we were doubling down on education. My grandma had her big wooden spoon, but everyone got a master's degree or a PhD. I knew from the time I was a little kid that I was going to college. No questions asked. I was going to get a professional degree, no questions asked. Right? That was an expectation my family had solidified in our family culture of education. It was never a question. We were going to do that, and that was a born into privilege. Right? I was born into my family. I was born into that privilege. I inherited that expectation. My families did the after school thing, right? They bought in to the white socialization process of Americanization. I had ballet lessons. I had French lessons. You guys, it was horrible. I was the chubby little ballerina. I just wanted to do Spanish dancing, but I couldn't, right? Those experiences I had, going to Europe in high school, going to Alaska by the time I was in 8th grade, those experiences helped socialize me for later in life when I went to an Ivy League college, for example, Dartmouth College. I knew what fork to use. I had been to the opera several times by the time I was in high school. I was well acquainted with the powers of whiteness, right? And that helps me navigate those same avenues of leadership in my current path as an academic, right? And I call that the weaponization of whiteness. I use my privilege, class privilege, lightness privilege, right? Heteronormative privilege. Although I'm a bisexual woman, because my partner is a male, I have heteronormative privilege, right? And I talk about how I can use these lenses, these different parts of my positionality, and use critical lenses like intersectionality and whiteness studies and critical race theory in order to help critically reflect on my experiences, right? So when someone is interacting with me, many times they don't see a Native American woman, even though I am, right? And I'm proud of it. But I have to highlight that part of my identity because of colonization of my light skin, right? And this inherited wealth, right? So when I talk about being the 1% of Native Americans, it's because I'm educated, and not a lot of Native Americans ever get that opportunity to pursue higher education, much less pay for it, much less graduate, right? We have linguistic issues to overcome. We have financial issues to overcome. We have huge cultural issues to overcome, right? I literally was depressed. It was culture shock at Dartmouth College, and I didn't think I belonged there. And the little girl from the res, what right did I have to be there, right? My professors, they had written the books on this, that, or the other, and I would hide. And it was a scary environment. And my best friend, my first gay best friend, his cottage, right, or his cabin in the woods was this giant, like, 4-bedroom house that was, like, 2-story, and it was giant, right? I had never seen wealth on this level before. But we have to understand that's all historically constructed, right? After World War II with the FHA loans, it was $120 billion that was invested in white households to construct what we now know as American suburbia, right? Generation after generation, we understand how redlining has devalued the homes for people of color just because we live in those communities, because the false criminalization of Black and brown bodies, partially through the war on drugs. Right? This is the information that we don't get in our K-12 education, that we do have to make sure that we're providing the background and the history that has affected all of our communities, so that our children grow up really having a solid and positive identity formation of who they are as Black, brown, Asian, gay, marginalized folks, right? We all have a right, and we've all constructed what this empire is that is America. But at the same time, we also have to reflect on where we fit in there and how we see ourselves have been constructed by powers and forces before we were even born, right? Like, the reason I speak English only happened because of boarding school 50 years before I was born. I have no control over that whatsoever, right? And that is because it's historically constructed. So as we talk about the privilege that I had inherited, right? So again, 1% of the reservation, which means that both of my parents had higher education degrees, right? So I had that privilege I talked about as a child. So not every Native American person gets that. And I always make sure to tell my students, I am not any smarter than any other Native American person. I am just better trained. And that is what is so insidious about this white supremacist structure in which we live in, right? White supremacists, not in like neo-Nazis, right? Although that is reoccurring. Right? There is a neo-Nazi movement going on within the Trump supporters, right? He has very clear racialized messages about who this new America is, right? What he's creating. White America is very clearly racialized as part of his campaigning message, right? The whole idea of these rallies, it speaks of history repeating itself, and these are very real markers that we should be very well aware of, right? And so when I got married, part of my inherited wealth was to actually inherit a piece of property. I got married and my parents signed over a piece of property to me as a wedding present. And it was valued at, depending on the time period, depending on whether or not there's an economic crash, anywhere from $10,000 to $20,000, which means that I already started out life ahead of all other Native Americans, not only having the socialization process and expectation that I was going to go to school, but also having the wealth and experience to back that up. My parents had gone to college, so they knew what a FAFSA was. They knew that I had to sit down and write my college essays. They literally were there. They knew that I had to go get those recommendation letters from my college counselor, right? I always talk about how my mom literally faced discrimination in the form of microaggression because my college counselor told her that I was not going to get into the Ivy League school, that I was not material for that type of school. And to be honest, I wasn't, you guys. At the time, I didn't really have an interest in school. I was a B+ student. I was really smart. I did like a 10-page report on the Thornbirds and War and Peace. And I did all this ridiculous outside work that I somehow rationalized my teachers into taking. I was a good thinker, but I didn't like traditional school, right? It wasn't for me. But my mom fought for my right to apply, to at least say, hey, as a Native American person, I deserve to apply to this Ivy League school. And guess what? Even though I was a token Indian, I am grateful for that opportunity. And I always tell my students, you guys, if you get the opportunity, I don't care if you are taking it because of affirmative action. We get little opportunity as it is, and we do not have the same inherited, racialized, embedded systems that are invisible to the common eye that whites have been benefiting from years. This is well documented, you guys. This is not crazy off the wall stuff. This is not conspiracy theory. This is basically sociology. This is education. This is educational psychology. This is whiteness studies. This is critical race theory. This is legal studies. This is This is very apparent in many fields. The only problem is you have to pay money to go to college and specialize to find out all this information. But it is there. And that is what is so terrifying, you guys, is that this information is not widely available. So how do we get this information out there to the masses? Well, part of that is watching this video. So thank you very much for participating. What I did want to hit on today was 3 articles. The first one is from the Harvard Gazette, and this was dated April 14th. And don't forget, the links are going to be in the description. But it talks about how 200 Black people die every single day in the United States, who would not have died if the health experiences of African Americans were equivalent to that of whites. So what this is really addressing is the inequality that racial groups literally equates in America. Right? There are some sociological studies that can show, especially like places like California, where income inequality is also tied directly to housing, right? People can be a distance of a couple miles away, but their life expectancy due to race is 10 to 20 years in difference, right? That literally means that because of the race that you're born into, that affects how long you're going to live. The second article I wanted to touch on was coming out of the University of Chicago, which is talking about how COVID-19 outbreaks have disproportionately harmed those who are already struggling before the pandemic. So this means that our impoverished populations, especially those communities of color who historically, right, redlining, the fact that most communities of color, we couldn't even get to higher education since the 1960s, which means that, you know, we've been going to school for basically 60 years. Woohoo, you guys. But that does not and cannot compete with the historic legacy and privilege that whites have enjoyed and their access to higher education and their ability for their homes to quadruple in wealth and therefore pay for their future generations' college educations and pass along that privilege, right? That is all inherited wealth. That communities of color have been, we've been cut out of that, right? Especially Native Americans, for example. The number one place for you to have any sort of wealth is through your house, right? Native Americans, because we have been on reservations, had no ability to have loans until about, I'd say about 30 years ago, right? The Tiwa Lending Company, which I know the Pueblo of Isleta has, is a wonderful resource that we've been able to use, the Pueblo of Isleta, that is still fairly new, right? That is within my recent memory. And so that basically means that for the last 30 years, that is the first time we've been able to buy homes and invest and build on our own land, right? Before that, we were basically cut out of that market. And that, again, promotes racial inequality and these huge disparities. And when it comes to wealth, we know that it affects every other facet of life. Your access to education, your ability to good housing, good jobs, right? Access to good health care. And so additionally, it says, according to the ongoing survey of U.S. households, over 50% of women making less than $30,000 have lost income during the first month of the crisis. And that basically means our most vulnerable population have already been hit very hard. We don't know the ramifications of that. We've definitely had reports nationally about various unemployment online systems going down or not being accessible to people. And so we really need to start addressing those infrastructure issues to make sure that these most vulnerable populations get access to the resources they need right now. It also talks about how the income inequality is depending on your race and gender. It says, in addition to 42% of non-white workers making $45,000 to $75,000 reported losing income, compared to just 26% of white workers in the same range. So when we look at incomes that are above that, right, for people of color who are non-white, they're getting hit, right, at a 42% rate of getting hit with income versus the 26% compared to their white counterparts. So again, that is racial inequality once again at play. So I hope that this has given you guys something to think about. And as always, hashtag be safe, my global family.